Good evening and welcome to all listeners and viewers throughout Alaska and the United States. You're watching an episode of Danakanaga's Our People Speak series with the Morris Thompson Cultural Visitor Center, Tanana Chiefs Conference, and Danakanaga. I am Sharon Hildebrand. Tonight's presentation, Our Way of Life, Then, Now, and Forever. Thanks to our major sponsor, Doi Unlimited, and during the evening, you can find more shows on the Morris Thompson website, and if you feel compelled to support this type of programming, there are links on there as well. Again, I'm Sharon Hildebrand. I'm from Nulato, where I was raised by my grandmother, Ellen Peters. I'm the Village Outreach Liaison at Doi Unlimited. We have a great show for you this evening with esteemed elder and leader, Miranda Wright. Miranda Wright is a retired professor from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and she's also a board of director for Doi Unlimited, and she's also a retired business owner as well, local business owner. And her family owned a well-known dog mushing kennel, the Wright Kennels. And welcome, Miranda. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you, Sharon. I just want to mention that I also hail from the beautiful village of Nulato. That's where I grew up. Was actually born out in winter camp out in the Caillou Flats area in the upper Inoko River. Attended boarding school at the Pius X Mission in Skagway when I was a young gal, and like most people, went to Mount Edgecombe for my high school years. So I have friends all over Alaska. That's always a great benefit, I think, from our boarding schools.
I love that. I always enjoy going to meetings with you, and it's like a reunion of sorts when you run into all your friends and such from all over the state. Welcome.
Thank you.
So we were talking about our native way of life, and what does that mean to you?
That's a loaded question. When I think of our way of life, I think I need to go back and tell a little about myself and how I was raised and what my personal perspective of our native way of life is. Because I think everyone in our native communities probably have their own version of how they view our native way of life. But as I mentioned a bit ago, I was born in winter camp in the headwaters of the Inoko River. So we were very isolated. I guess you could consider it kind of like people living on a homestead with just one or two families. You know, there was our immediate family and then one or two of my dad's brothers and their families would be there also. And a few, cousins and stuff like that. But it was a very, very wild resource-based life. I think there were 6 of us kids and a couple of adopted ones. And so my dad was a trapper and a hunter and a provider. So I lived in that setting for the first 6 years of my life. We'd come out to the Yukon River in the spring and do some salmon fishing on the Yukon and travel to the village on weekends for our church services. But while in Mud River was the name of our camp. While we lived there, everything was very spiritual. We relied on the natural resources for our life. So everything we did had a purpose and a meaning. Mom always made sure that we were very respectful of the way we harvested the food that Dad brought in, or not harvesting, but the way we prepared it after Dad brought it in. And you couldn't step over my dad's hunting gear, or we couldn't wear his shoes. We had to respect him as a provider. And the women, the power of procreation that women have was something that was very important, and we could not mix those two because the animals also had a spirit and a sense. So there was just this whole spiritual interconnection with everything that we did. Life wasn't just about providing food. It was about keeping harmony and balance throughout everything and everyone. So those spiritual interconnections, to me, forms the fundamental structure of our native way of life. When you say our native way of life, to me, it's not just hunting and fishing. It's much broader than that. And again, to me, it's that spiritual interconnection that we have with all things.
Beautiful. So it's like being in balance with everything.
Totally.
And it's not just culturally, but it's spiritually as well.
That's right.
So the backyard was your church, so to say.
It was because, my mother was a very compassionate woman. And, I mean, if there was a bird that fell out of a nest, we got to bring it in and revive that bird and, take care of it. I was just sharing with my grandkids yesterday. We were watching a robin chasing a squirrel out in the yard, and they were the little grandkids were just amazed that a robin was actually chasing a squirrel away. And I was sharing with them how we always had a pet robin when I was growing up, and we never kept it in a cage. It flew freely through the house. And when they adopted my youngest brother, Richie, or youngest at that time, the robin slept on the edge of his crib. And if anyone was approaching the house, the robin would just start squawking and start flying circles in the house, warning us that someone was approaching. So it was like a watchdog in a sense, that same type of behavior. So again, it's just all of those connections that we have that
Beautiful.
I think kind of is encompassed in that native way of life.
I love it. In harmony with everything. For many years, our native way of life was referred to as subsistence. Now, many Native people and groups are saying that it isn't the term to use. What are your thoughts about this? And is there something or a term that you feel would address our connection for Alaska Native people and the land?
The term subsistence is always a struggle for me, because when you look at the term, just a basic term, it's referring to an economic model of being able to obtain just your bare minimum needs for survival. Nothing more. There's no surplus. There's nothing. It's just the bare minimum. And to me, that does not encompass what I was just sharing with you about our native way of life, because it's not just about food. There's a whole complex structure out there that creates who we are. So to me, that model doesn't cut it, or the term or subsistence. Now, if we were to look at the phrase subsistence economy, it goes a little further, but there again, it's looking at one segment of that fundamental structure that I'm talking about. It's looking basically just at food security. It's not looking at the overall elements that make up that spiritual connection that I was referring to. And then you can take it another step further and look at the federal subsistence law definitions, and they expand subsistence to include Alaska Natives under traditional and customary use. And I think we'll probably be talking about that a little more in a bit. But then it takes it probably a little further than just a basic definition of subsistence. But it's still an economic model that I feel does not encompass our native way of life.
And with that, what would is there a word you feel that would encompass or that describes this way of life? What's that word instead of subsistence? What is there a word?
I think the phrase native way of life is very encompassing because, as I mentioned, there's this fundamental structure that is our native way of life, and it has all of these interconnections. Everything somehow is related to something else. And you can't find just one label like the word subsistence that encompasses all of that. So I do like the phrase native way of life.
Very good. I like that. How does customary and traditional use of the land contribute to continuation of rural communities in Alaska?
when you look at the federal law that defines traditional and customary use, I think they get closer to this fundamental structure that I'm talking about, because they don't necessarily refer to just food resources or, I guess they encompass a lot more of the usage of all of the parts of the animal. So it's reaching a little closer to that whole interconnection that we have of not wasting and being able to share everything that we have. But it's still an economic model. And the economic models are based on a market economy, a cash economy. And it's based on wealth, that material wealth, which is something in our native ways of life we don't look at. I was raised to never brag about what we owned. That you always remained humble and respectful, especially when you were talking about some of the animals that fed us. You were very careful about the way you referred to them or the names that you used to call, or when you're speaking of them, if you were allowed to speak of them, because there's some animals that as women we're not allowed to mention. So, there's all of those types of things that I think go into that whole discussion. But again, I think the federal definition under ANILCA tried to encompass that a little bit more. You look at some of the byproducts of the animals that is allowed, that Alaska Natives are allowed to use and to create a cottage industry with. And there again, being able to create a cottage industry pushes us toward that market economy. So we're constantly adapting and adjusting as Native people. So again, because of that, I don't feel they could put one sticker on us and say, this is who we are. And to me, that Native way of life allows for those changes to occur. And we've been here for tens of thousands of years. We are a very resilient people. We're very adaptive. And to me, this shows it. It's just I feel like I'm starting to ramble. So
No,
I'll give you back the mic for a minute.
One of the things I remember we had visited about one time, and it's come up in other conversations, is you talked about not bragging and how our people, there's ways in our traditions that allows everyone to get a piece of something when their family might not have a strong supporter or like a man in the family to hunt for them. So you have different traditional events that occur during the year that allows you to redistribute the wealth in the community, right? Can you explain some of that?
And, when I was talking about the spiritual connections, that encompasses a lot of that, of the sharing that we do, the ceremonies that we hold, the potlatches, the trade fairs that were so big in those early days. And those trade fairs were generally held in the spring. And that was because of the shortages that most people would run up against towards spring. All of their winter caches had been depleted, or most of their winter caches had been depleted. So the trade fair was a chance for people to get together socially. Many marriages were built because of the trade fairs, for people to meet family members that they hadn't seen for months and months, to make new friends, and to share those resources that they had. They would trade, whether you had an extra supply of dried eating fish, and someone maybe had some romaine or babiche that you could trade. Oftentimes, our people from the Nulato Caillou area would trade on the coast. We would trade birch bark canoes for walrus babiche because it was very strong for lashing sleds and snowshoes. And so, there was just a lot of those types of things going on. And always, again, the sharing of that food. It just, what little you had, you brought, and somehow or other it was exchanged and redistributed among the people. And so to me, it was one of the most beautiful things about our culture. And today, one of the remnants of that is we have a celebration at New Year's. Mm-hmm. We call it Mitsiaka. Mm-hmm. And it's evolved and it's changed a lot through time. But we go from house to house with a canvas mm-hmm. and sing the caribou song. Mm-hmm. And people would throw food into the canvas. And then they take it to the community hall and have a big feast that evening where they're singing and dancing and a redistribution of all of that food among the community. So to me, that's probably one of the last vestiges of the spring trade fairs that we have in our communities.
Mm. Brings a smile to my face thinking about it. I always have good memories of Mitsiaka.
Right.
Yeah, Mitsiaka, hatne, hatne.
Yes, and it's fun. People make it a lot of fun. Sometimes they'll throw a young girl in the canvas and
little
toss
baby,
her up, or babies. It's just people always know how to put humor and laughter into everything we do.
So for our listeners that might not be familiar with Nulato and its early beginnings, can you explain some of that? Like there was a Russian trading post there, and behind the hills is Unalakleet, and so upriver was Galena, downriver Celtic. What was the importance of Nulato at that time?
Nulato was actually a fishing spot for our people. Not where the current village is, but about half a mile downstream of the Yukon is the confluence of the Nulato River. And there's a lot of salmon that spawn in that river. So that's where our village was, on what the locals currently refer to as 2 Mile. That was the side, or the southern side of the Nulato Rivers, where our early village actually was located. And they used to have trade fairs there, and people would come across the Unalakleet, the pass from Unalakleet and Buckland and Shungnak and a lot of those places on the upper Kobuk River in different areas. And we'd have a huge trade fair there in Nulato. Well, when the Russians were in, the Russian Fur Company was active in Alaska, they had basically depleted the sea otter down along the Aleutians, and lo and behold, comes this French tradition of men wearing these big, beautiful top hats. Guess what that was made out of?
Martin.
Felted beaver.
Ah.
And some people may know what felted beaver is because some of the very top of the line Western or cowboy hats are made from felted beaver. So they had sent some excursions into the interior and probably some conversations with other native guides. They realized that the interior was very rich with beaver. So the Russians came into the interior. They arrived in Nulato about 1833. And at the time, Nulato, the original village down at the 2 Mile area that I was telling you about, was under siege by smallpox. There were 11 people in the village at the time, and by the time the Russians had left for the season, there was a man and 2 children that were left there. And they said it was a very sad situation. So they left for the winter and they came back, and they established a post about half a mile upstream from that site. The old man was still alive, and one of the boys was still alive, and he was very scarred from smallpox. But they managed to survive. He had put all of the people in one of the underground houses, the people who had died, and then eventually just set that whole structure on fire. Had a huge, it was basically a huge crematory. But and the Russian post eventually took the young boy. He was in his early teens, and he started working for them at the post there. And so that evolved, because of the fur trade. The Russian post was there for a number of years, and then when the Americans came in and started exploring and had some interest in Alaska, then they took over the posts in Nulato. The Americans did. There was a lot of native Russians, indigenous people from the Siberia area that were in Alaska with the Russian Fur Company as their workers. And many of those had already intermarried with the local native women. So many of those remained in Alaska. You also had many people, Finnish, Polacks, and all kind of different European mix who worked for the Russian American Company, and they were all referred to as Russians. Excuse me. So anyhow, then after the Russians departed, they had a trading post in Nulato, and the Americans came in and they continued the site, and they established a military site in Nulato. And it was also a site where they were trying to lay the telegraph line, the Siberian telegraph line. So there was a lot of activity out of the Nulato areas. People went up the Kaikuk River and toward Unalakleet and different areas, exploring all of that area. And there had also been excursions going toward the Cook Inlet. And some people who lived in that area ended up moving down toward Nundalton. And many of the people from Nundalton actually came from that interior base.
Oh, interesting.
They went down through the Stony River and the Lime River and through that area. But, it has a very deep and rich history. Before the Americans arrived, there was a massacre in Nulato, and I believe it was in 1855, where it was an internecine war, or a war between the tribes. And there was a lot of things that were going on. As I mentioned earlier, the smallpox was wiping out a lot of people. And it was causing a lot of chaos among our people. Many people, especially our spiritual intermediaries or medicine men, as people often refer to them, were dying. And they weren't able to help the people with all of these epidemics that were hitting them. The populations around Anvik, on Lower Yukon, below Nulato in our area, were estimated at over 1,000 Native people when the Russians came in. The community was so large, they had 2 kashims to help with their celebrations. And they figured the epidemics, particularly the smallpox, probably wiped out 50 to 80% of the Native population. So there was drastic changes that were going on. And the fact that the spiritual intermediaries were not able to help our people through these pandemics, I think made it a lot easier for our people to accept Christianity when Christianity came in. So anyhow, then the American company comes in and they established a military base in Nulato. And Nulato was a thriving metropolis. It was the largest community in the interior at the time. They had like 2 pool halls. They had a hospital there. They had a Japanese restaurant. It was amazing the things that were going on in Nulato at the time. So that's kind of the deep history in a nutshell on Nulato.
Interesting. I was over in Russia, Eastern Russia, and I saw some photos over there, and I saw a picture that looked just like Uncle Bergman.
Uncle Bergman.
On the wall. Yep. You could tell they're our relatives.
Yeah.
So interesting. What part of the Alaska Native culture would be lost without the traditional and customary use of our lands?
When we talk about the traditional and customary use of our lands, I think I like to open it a little more to, I think, maybe the way the federal government even used that phrase, but it's of our wild resources. Because to me, there's just so much that we use besides just hunting and fishing. We do a lot of gathering, and there's a lot of small game and stuff that we utilize. There's a lot of plants that are utilized for medicinal purposes. So to me, wild resources would be a more appropriate term in my opinion. But so when you look at that and what would we lose? Again, I want to reiterate how resilient and adaptive we are over the tens of thousands of years that we've been here. Our resources have changed, but we're still here. And to me, that is very significant that our people are here. Our ancestors are here with us. They guide us. They set the path that we walk on. They shared their knowledge. And when I look at that knowledge and that spiritual interconnection that we have with everything, even our ancestors, is the one thing that I think we'll hold intact. Resources will come and go, and we'll adapt to that. You look at today, you look at the changes that we're going through, climate change, the whole pressures of the market economy that is now upon us, the encroachment on the wild resources by many people. There's a lot of concern right now in our communities because of all of these pressures. And it's heart-wrenching. It's heart-wrenching. But knowing that we are resilient and we are survivors and that we're going to adapt and keep going, to me, is very important. And that spiritual connection that we have is the one thing that I think will stay intact with our people and keep us moving forward.
Beautiful. I love that. And in thinking about adaptation and such, there's a saying that you need to learn to walk in both worlds with one spirit that is living and working in Western society, complete with a job, 8 to 5, mortgages and such. Our native way of life that has sustained us for thousands of years, hunting and fishing and gathering. How do we balance these things? And is it becoming harder for individuals to live in both worlds, in your experience?
I think it is definitely harder. You look at today's world, you look at all of the movements, the Black Lives Matter, the Asian people and the struggles and challenges that they're facing. It's no different for Alaska Natives. We've had issues in those areas for eternity. But I think keeping your identity and knowing who you are is very important to overcome that. And, we were raised, like I mentioned earlier, to be humble and not to brag. Many people remain silent, and basically, you need to learn how to choose your battles. You not to be reactive to everything that is thrown at you, but being very astute in which battles you want to engage in. I think it's very important. Again, we look at all of the challenges that are facing us right now, and people tend to get very reactive. And I think people just need to stop, take a deep breath, and reflect on which battle and which one do you want to take on right now, which is most important for our survival. And, it goes on and on. But again, I think we have the resiliency to maneuver all of those challenges.
Beautiful. What advice would you give your grandchildren who are living in both worlds?
To be proud of who you are, know who you are, and make sure that you're comfortable with that. It's just some people say, I'm proud to be Native. I ask them, what are you proud of? Well, I'm Native. I said, what does that mean to you? And oftentimes they cannot provide an answer. They're reiterating a phrase that they've heard, and because they think it's cool. So I said, it's fine to be proud to be a Native, but understand, what does that mean to you? And you have to know who you are, be comfortable in your skin, be comfortable with what you're doing, and above all, remain humble. We
have, I was thinking about the the story you had told at one time about spirituality and respect for the animals and how we balance that. And I wonder if you could tell us the story about when the men get a wolverine and the what happens around that event when it's brought into town. And I always think about your dad and the way he told it, and can you tell us the story?
I wish I could be half the storyteller that he was. I could sit for hours listening to him tell stories like that. But, the wolverine is one of those animals that has no regard for anything. It's a very destructive animal in many ways. It will come to your cache, as an example, and you leave its scent and its mark and just basically destroy whatever you have in your cache. So it was also always referred to as doyan, which is an adaptation of a Russian transmitted Mongolian word, which means a big person or an important person. Chief is, I think, one of the more contemporary terms they use to define doyan. So the wolverine was given this name because they figured it had no regard for anything. It would destroy like it was a rich person. So again, those connections that I spoke of about the spirituality, again, is encompassed in just that whole belief right there with the wolverine and how it has no regard for certain things so it goes against the grain of our traditional ways. And so anyhow, with that said, the wolverine was also a very important, the pelt of the wolverine was very important. Many people use it, around their parkas and their fur ruffs because the fur wouldn't ice up. So it was a very, very warm and protective covering close to your face. So they referred to it as doyan anyhow. So when someone was caught an animal or was gifted an animal, as our people often said, because they're very sly animals and not too many people have the skills to capture one of them. The people usually drape it around their shoulders, the hunter, when they're coming into the village, and they'll start chanting, doyan or horse, doyan or horse. The boss is coming to town, basically is what they're saying. And so they bring it in with an honor. It was an honor that they had it draped around their shoulder. They were giving it a ride as I guess you could say that was the wolverine's carriage on the shoulders of the hunter. So they would bring it in and they would set it up in the home of the halt of the hunter, and they would place it in a seated position, like it was a man sitting down. That's how they would position the wolverine. They'd put a stone in its mouth, and then they would have a men's party. And I can't really describe what goes on at the men's party because I've never been to one. But the women would prepare the food, and they would come in, and the children, young boys, were also allowed. My uncle, I remember him, he's like 90 years old, but sharing that he was just a young boy when someone in the village had brought in a wolverine, and his mother gave him a box of cookies. And if you can imagine, my uncle being 90 years old today, and you take back 80 years ago, cookies were probably a very treasured thing in the village. So that was a very prized possession that he was taking to share with the wolverine. But, that was how respectful people were about an animal like that, and that it's giving itself, and that they're continuing on and seeking a blessing for the gift and for everyone sharing in that whole process. So it's a ceremony in itself, and I think it's very important. In fact, I could share another story for you if you have the time.
Oh, yeah.
There was a man in the community who was perceived to be a very important man. He was a good provider, so he had he was able to take care of his large extended family, and he had a beautiful daughter that was of age, and so many people were coming and asking for her hand. And in those days they had arranged marriages. Well, the father was very particular. He was not going to let the first fellow that came along take his daughter away and swoop her off her feet. So there was one man in the community who didn't have much, but he felt that he needed a wife, he needed a life partner to help him make it through life, because our people always believed that you could not survive by yourself. It was a community effort, or you always had to have someone there to help you. So he had been turned down by the father when he asked for the girl's hand. So he started keep watching the father, what he was doing. The father, like I said, was a good provider, and he had his trap line, and so the man would kind of follow the father at a distance to see where he was going and where his trap line was. And so on the days that the father didn't go check the trap line, I think he went out every other day or every 2 days or whatever it was, the man would go out and check the man's trap line. Eventually, he got lucky. Lo and behold, there was a wolverine in the trap. So the man came back, and I mentioned earlier that it was very important the way we referred to our animals. Often we didn't discuss them by their name. So anyhow, the man came back to the community and went to visit the man with the daughter, and said something to the effect, "My moccasins have holes in the bottom. It sure would be nice if I had someone to repair them for me." And the man looked at him, put his hat on, and went out the door. Went straight out to his trap line. He must have had a sense that this man had been out there following his trap line. And he came in with the wolverine on the carriage, going on to a horse. So he had to give his daughter to this man. When the man asked about the moccasins, or mentioned the moccasins, he was asking for the woman's hand in marriage again. And the man knew enough that this man had been refused before, that something had occurred that would bring this man to ask for a second time. And he figured it out. He figured it out. It was because he had been lucky. And that was, the significance of that is how powerful the spiritual beliefs that people have in that wolverine. That this man coming to let the man know that he had luck was enough for him to give his daughter up in marriage. So.
Interesting. Very cool. Another story that I remember your dad telling was how he went way down river, down Grayling or Shagaluk somewhere, and how he'd go to everyone's home and they'd feed him. He'd go to another home and they'd feed him. And it's back to that same thought about luck. They believe that you treat people good and it'll come back to you. Can you share some of that story with us? Maybe not that particular story, but maybe something similar to it with that same context?
Well, when I was young, and when we went up to Mud River, we went by boat. So we'd leave Nulato in August, and we'd travel all the way down to Grayling. And if the river was high enough, we'd take what is referred to as the Yukon Slough. That would take us up to the Unoco River around the area of the former Holigachuk. If the river was low, then we went all the way down by Holy Cross and then went up the mouth of the Unoco and stopped in Shagaluk and some of the other places. Sometimes we did it intentionally because so many of the the students at the Holy Cross Mission were from Nulato, and the family wanted to visit with some of their relatives there also. But on the way down, and then we'd go up to Unoko to the Mud River, and the whole trip was probably 2 weeks. We probably could have made it in 5 days, but once you left Nulato, we stopped at every camp from there all the way down to the lower Yukon. And it was part of the way you showed respect for the people there. You hadn't seen them for a while. You visited with them. You exchanged stories. You had a cup of tea. And one thing that we learned through Dad is if they put out a lot of food, you just ate a snack because we're going to stop at the next camp and they're going to have food also. So you don't overindulge in any of those settings. Plus, that whole notion of not being greedy and acknowledging the fact that it's very difficult to obtain your food. So be very respectful of what people offer you and thank them, but just have enough to show your appreciation. And so anyhow, that was a part of all of that. So it was always fun because people would share their experiences, and it was the way that we learned. Today, like my grandkids, we get bored. It's all that old stuff. But my parents drummed into our heads that you sit there quietly and you listen because they will tell you something. One of their experiences will be something that you may encounter in the future. And you'll know how to get through that experience from the information that these people shared with you.
That's very good advice for our listeners out there. Miranda Wright is sharing stories about living along the Yukon River and stories with her grandchildren and such. And thinking back to growing up in those times and living off the land, what's a fun memory that you remember that you can tell us from living off the land?
One of the things that I always enjoyed when we were on the Mud River is sledding. And we had to, we worked. We did a lot of work, but we made a game out of everything. If we were cutting wood, we would see who could hold the saw the straightest, because oftentimes we had a whip saw or a Swede saw. So as for kids, 7 years old, we're working at wood. So those were always a game, or we'd make a seesaw out of a log that's on a sawhorse, and someone breaks a saw, and then we all take off somewhere else. So, things like that. And then we had to carry in snow for washing and also snow for drinking. Usually the snow off the surface area is what you use for your laundry or for your washing, and the deeper down snow is what you would retrieve for cooking or washing or drinking. And then we had ice. We had once the river froze over, Dad had a big saw that he would use to cut chunks of ice. So we'd haul those up in the sled, and we had a big drum in the house that we'd fill up with ice, and that would thaw, and that was our drinking water. But we had a trail that went down off the bank. The banks are fairly high, and so we'd sled down those banks, and it was always a lot of fun. And one of my fun memories is I was the youngest at the time, and I had three or four older siblings. And my brother pushed a sled with a bunch of us girls in the basket down, and we feel, oh man, we're going to go for a long ride. Well, we did go for a long ride, but we also rammed in my dad's ice chisel.
Oh no.
Sent it flying and snapped it in two. So then we had to find a way of sneaking back into the house. Somehow that ice chisel just broke. So things like that to me were always a lot of fun. You just like we'd be going down, like I said, to pick up some ice or something, but we'd turn it into a sledding game, and so it was always a lot of fun.
Very good. And in thinking back to the traditional upbringing, what are some of the things that have carried over to your life today that has benefited you to your success of who you are?
I think just being true to who I am. I've lived here in Fairbanks for over 50 years, but I still maintain much of my native way of life. You talked about walking in two worlds, and you have to know when your 8 to 5 job is on, that you have a certain behavior that you have to work under. But when I'm home, it's my native home. I was just sold a freezer, a 23 cubic foot freezer, that we always kept full with native food. It's very seldom that I go to the store and buy meat from the grocery store. I have fish, ducks, wild chickens, meat, and we take pride in the way we put our meat away. We take very good care of it, like we were taught when we were young. And to me, those are very important. I do a lot of sewing, traditional sewing, and I try to pass that on to my children also. I even taught my daughter how to tan moose ears.
Cool.
The hair in the moose ear, is very soft, and it's wonderful for making mittens for the babies.
That's what Grandma Rita made one of my son's little moccasins out of the baby, well, not baby, maybe if they're lucky, they get babies. But it's usually the moose ears that they use because it's really soft.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even the larger ones are soft.
Yeah. Very good. While you were talking, I was thinking about, there was something else. When you're growing up, you said there was a lot of people that you have at the camp. And I heard somebody else say it's because there's a lot of work that needs to be done at a camp. It's not easy work. Everybody knew what their job was. And I'm guessing that was the same for your big camp at that time.
Our camp wasn't really that big.
Yeah.
In fact, your grandma, Ellen, and Uncle Aloysius were at the camp also, and talking about knowing the roles of people and how you select people to join you at those camps is the fact that my mother was pregnant with me, and Ellen was a midwife. So Dad invited his Uncle Al and his family to come up to the camp also, so that when Mother was due, Ellen would be there to deliver. So it's very important, okay, and who you're selecting. We've had other uncles there throughout the years that we were there. My grandmother Annie Akata was there, and one of the things I always remember about Grandma Annie, in the springtime, when the snow was starting to thaw, and we used to have crust, the top layer of the snow would get very icy, and we'd be able to walk on the top of it. But underneath the spruce trees, there'd be no snow, and it'd be really dry. And I remember sitting under the spruce tree with Grandma and my sisters, and there was a bird building a bird nest. And I was young. Like I said, I was 6 years old when we moved from the camp, so I was, 5 or 6 years old enough that I remember anyhow. And I kept saying, Grandma, what that bird's doing? Grandma, what that bird got in its mouth? Grandma, where did that bird go? And all the while, Grandma would go like this to me. She would never say a word. She would just use her arms and her hand to motion for us to be quiet and to remain still. We sat there for, I don't know how long we were there under that tree with Grandma. But before we left, we were able to see the bird nest that was created. So just little things like that to me are just so precious, and just the lesson from Grandma of the importance of watching and observing without making a lot of noise.
Beautiful. I love it. In thinking back, what do you see the future of Alaska's native traditional way of life? What do you see for the future?
Gosh, where's my crystal ball? I see a lot of change, continued change. And I don't see it as bad. It's going to be a challenge. There will be a lot of hardships, of course, for many people. But as I mentioned earlier, we've been here for tens of thousands of years. We're adaptive and we're resilient. Resources will change from what we are probably accustomed to, at least what our generation is accustomed to. Right now, the whole issue with salmon, like I mentioned, is just really distressing to so many, including myself. But something else will come along, and there'll be changes. But the pressures from the market economy, I think, is some of the hardest things that we have to face. Because you look at Alaska, where we have the largest fishing industry in the United States. They bring in billions of dollars into the Alaska economy. We, as personal users of fish, cannot compete with that. So the restrictions that are being placed on us, people have no regard. I mean, as far as they're concerned, Yukon king salmon isn't that great fish. They'd rather sell reds or sockeye. So those are challenges that we're going to face. But, our people always had an abundance of fish that they could rely on besides salmon. You look at the whitefish, you look at pike, you look at sheefish. And now, a lot of people are bringing in halibut from the coast, trading and bartering. It's probably going to be alive and well, where we're probably going to be doing a lot of that with our coastal friends and relatives. But I think in the long run, the whole spirituality and that fundamental structure, our native way of life, is going to remain intact. You look at what's going on in Fairbanks as an example, where we have the tribal hall, and it's become a central point for the Native community in Fairbanks. And we have a large Native population in Fairbanks. Some people call it a large village because we have so many people who have out-migrated from the rural areas. But you have so many things going on. The ceremonies that are being held in the urban center. You have a lot of potlatches, Native dancing. You have, like, next week, the World Indian Eskimo Olympics. That's going on. And then you look at social media and the role that social media is playing in connecting all of our people, no matter where you are. We can watch our family and our friends' children grow up on social media. People are sharing languages. Then now we have all of this genealogical database things that are going on, and people are reconnecting with relatives through their DNA search. So things are evolving and we're adapting, and I think we're still going to be very strong. Our resources, our wild resources, are going to change, definitely. But as a people, I think we'll still be around. You look at a lot of other indigenous groups. You look at the Chinese, whenever they move into a community, they develop like a Chinatown. The Asians have their own little enclaves within a city. And I think the same thing is, or something very similar, is happening with our Native community as well.
Beautiful. So the adaptation and changes that are occurring are not always a bad thing, but it's something that our Native people have been doing for millennia.
Millennia, yes.
Beautiful. Thank you, Miranda. That was very good storytelling. I appreciate it.
I was thinking, gee, maybe I am picking up some of Dad's traits. I can sure talk, can't I?
Thank you to all our listeners out there for listening. And we want to also remind you to vote, because the municipal and local elections is October 5th, 2021, and voting is very important. So remember to vote this year. And we also want to thank you for sharing these experiences with us. And we thank you all for tuning in this evening. And one final thing, do you have any final words for our listeners tonight?
I just want you to know that I love you all and wish you all a very, very warm summer.
Yes, we all need that. We had 2 days of summer, right? Again, thank you to Doi Unlimited that we can put together these programming and that are put on to the Morris Thompson Cultural and Visitor Center, as well as thank you to the Nakanaga and Tanana Chiefs Conference. Again, I'm Sharon Hildebrand. Masi.